I have to congratulate you, Mario, on very good programming because this builds directly on what Manuel was talking about. So that it was a perfect, very aligned talk that you all just heard from Manuel. But basically, this is one. This is what I'm going to talk about is the SaferAI approach to risk modeling, and especially how we tested it out on cyber. So let me see here. So during last year, we published a lot of papers on risk modeling at SaferAI. So we've been working at this for a year and a half, or even more, to develop a methodology for how this can be done. And of course, you'll see a lot of commonalities in what you heard from Manuel because we've been working closely with the AI office. And then I will also share some examples from cyber. So we're going to start with just why risk modeling matters, which you've heard a little bit from Manuel, but I will go into some more aspects there. I'll walk you through our methodology step by step. I'll show you all the kinds of different questions that can help answer when it comes to cyber specifically by showing you the cyber risk models that we built last year. But then I also want to stress, and I want to leave you with the open question. So this is another, again, a call to any researchers that is interested in this, because like we heard before, right, there are a lot of, this is a very nascent field. There's a lot of open questions. So I want to run through some of those and hopefully spark some interest in some of you. But we start with why risk modeling. So the kind of the current setup for most AI companies, as you see in their frontier safety frameworks, as you see in their responsible scaling policies or their model cards, is this idea of a threshold evaluation based on capabilities. So there is a benchmark. You look at whether that benchmark hits a specific binary capability. If that threshold is exceeded, then these mitigation actions kick into place. But in this, this seems reasonable at a first glance if you don't think about it too hard. But unfortunately, capabilities do not equal harm, right? They do not equal risk. They are just an imperfect proxy for risk. So in order for something, for a harm, for harm to happen from a capability, there's a whole sequence of events, which includes who is using the model, what target they're going after, what the defenses are of that target, etc., etc. So capabilities is really just one input. And so what happens when you use only capability-based thresholds is that they are prone to different interpretations because they're much more vague, and different companies can interpret them differently, and then they can internally revise them when needed as well. So what we've seen from a lot of the AI companies is that they just adapt these capability-based thresholds when needed. And they're just less decision relevant, right? Because you can't ask, like, are we okay with the overall level of risk of this model that we're going to deploy? Or how much risk did our mitigations actually reduce? So what we need to connect these model capabilities to real world harm is, in our view, risk modeling. So risk modeling can be that bridge that bridges what a model can do in a vacuum, in vitro, when you test it in a lab setting, to real world harm, right? The actual harm that can happen to people, property, or the environment in the real world, which is what we care about at the end of the day. So this reframes the question, right? It goes from, does the model have X capability, to what expected harm could this capability actually lead to? And basically, we think that this can enable a lot of different users, and Manuel touched on some of this. So basically, if you have, you still start with the benchmarks on the left here, as you see, but then if you have a quantitative risk model in the middle, that then enables much more direct uses of this. So first of all, the decision maker. So we want decision makers at AI companies to be able to know how much risk will increase if they deploy a specific model or even start to develop a specific model. And similarly, decision makers, the policymakers, can be enabled by risk models to make decisions around, is a model safe enough to be deployed? And then, very importantly, like we heard in the earlier presentation as well, mitigations, right? So the defenders, the CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, have limited resources and cannot strengthen their defenses across the board. But having risk models that pinpoint exactly where AI is increasing the risk can help them put in mitigations in the right places. And then finally, also, as we heard, as this was the perfect setup, the earlier presentation, the evaluation gaps, right? So where is there the largest uncertainty? If you build out the risk model, it shows you where we have the greatest uncertainty and where we need new evaluations to reduce that uncertainty, because definitely there is a wide spectrum of usefulness of benchmarks, and there are many areas of actual risk scenarios that they don't cover. In addition, there are some other good goals of risk modeling that goes for, I think, for society as a whole, right? We can enable comparisons across risks, because if you just look at capabilities, that allows for no comparison between risks, right? But AI, of course, creates all these risks. Just in the EU Code of Practice, we have the 4 big systemic risks like cyber, loss of control, and manipulation. And then, of course, we have many other risks as well from AI. And we need to, as a society, be able to compare between these, and that is where risk modeling can help. Risk modeling can create new insights because, again, you may want to look at combined effects of various capabilities, especially when you get to more agentic capabilities, rather than looking at them in a silo or in isolation. You can gain new insights by combining them into a risk model. Enabling risk thresholds. This is kind of the ideal goal, right? Like in an ideal world, we would like to have similar to what we have in other industries, as in pharma or as medical devices or aviation or nuclear. We have risk thresholds that are set where this is the acceptable level of risk, and we need some kind of quantification in order to be able to do those. And then finally, making claims verifiable. So as I mentioned, it's very easy to just adjust these vague capability-based thresholds, but if you have proper risk modeling, you can actually look at falsifiable and verifiable claims. So that's the backdrop for why we have been working on this. So let me tell you then a little bit about SaferAI's risk modeling methodology. And basically, it's a multi-step methodology, and we'll look at this step by step. But here is just an overall overview, how there is a risk universe, which comprises of all the different risk scenarios. From that, we pick risk models. For each risk model, we decompose it into parameters. So here you see, for example, attack attempt, the chain of events, the end harm. And then we measure this for a baseline and an AI level. And baseline can then be a sort of pre-AI level or with minimal assistance from AI. And that is what you compare the uplift from AI to. So to see how much risk AI adds. So let's look at this step by step. Defining risk scenarios to model. So basically, we have to choose dimensions, right? Like the risk universe is vast, and you can't model every potential risk scenario out there. So what we do is we pick dimensions. And for cyber, where we have done most of our work, we picked actor, target, and vector. So I wanted to show this as an example where we basically slice and dice the risk universe with these 3 different taxonomies, actor, target, and vector, and look at the potential combinations. And then we pick the most relevant and the most salient and the most important combinations. So these, and we'll come back to these later, so we're not going to go through them in detail now, but these were the 9 risk models that we built in cyber last year. As you can see, they are different combinations of OC level, which is RAND's classification of the operational capability of the type of attack. So OC1 is the most basic, the hacktivists, the script kiddies. OC5 is down to the most advanced nation states. Then you can have different kinds of targets. So either a financial target or an infrastructure target or an espionage target. And you can have different vectors. So what is the main vector of the attack? Is it phishing, or is it malware? Is it an IT to OT pivot? Or is it ransomware, for example? And then we combine these to cover as much as possible of the risk universe while minimizing the number of risk models that need to be created separately. Then once you have those scenarios, we then create risk models for each of them. And that is breaking down into factors. For cyber, but cyber is actually, it turns out, easier here. We're doing CBRN right now as part of a consortium for the AI office, and there we have more of these parameters. But for cyber, we broke it down into frequency, probability, and impact. Basically, how many actors will try to attempt these attacks, and how many times can they attempt it? What is the likelihood they'll succeed with each attempt? And then what is the impact? What is the overall damage if they do succeed? And then, as you see, the probability we then break down into steps. And there we're also using MITRE ATT&CK, as we'll see in a second. So we decompose these, and basically here we've established a number of heuristics in our methodology for how granular you should get. Because on one hand, you want to increase fidelity and you want to go as granular and as deep as possible, as we heard from Manuel as well. But at the same time, the more parameters that you include, the more you can potentially increase your model error as a whole. So there's a balance to strike there. And in our methodology, we developed a number of heuristics for sort of how deep you should go. So then you have the risk model. Then you estimate the baseline risk. So basically, what is the risk without AI? And this is, again, there's not a one perfect scenario here, right? Because we can't completely rewind the clock and go back to before we had large language models. But what we do is basically look at the case where the attacker has minimal, either not access to AI or just minimal use of AI. And we established the base rates then. So what is the historical pattern for the type of damage and the type of likelihood of success for these kinds of attack? We validate that with ground truth. So we look at, even though it's hard in cyber, as you all know, because we don't have perfect data, but where we can, we validate is this in the right at the right level of expected damage. And then we have experts review these, and we even do falsification experiments with them where we give them false data to check that they pick up on it. Then, so that gives us the baseline, the amount of risk in a non-AI world. Then we start with getting to the AI uplift. So we identify what we call key risk indicators, or KRIs. And this is where the benchmarks come in, right? So benchmarks is one of the key empirical sources of data. You could also use red teaming results or incident reports, but the way what we started with was benchmarks. So, but the key thing is that the benchmarks should inform the risk model and not just be taken as the ultimate source of truth themselves. So we map each benchmark to the nodes that it affects. So first, we pick the benchmarks based on which ones are not saturated, which of course has happened to a lot of them, which ones are rankable so that we can get an order of difficulty. And which ones apply most directly to our risk scenario. And then we map those. And then, only then, once you have those, we look at the AI uplift. And that goes through the layer of an expert. So we use expert elicitation in a Delphi process to translate between benchmark performance. So as you can see in this chart here, on different tasks. So, for example, the CTF tasks in Cybench, like the capture the flag tasks, there's 40 tasks in Cybench, and we picked some of those along the spectrum of difficulty and look at how much does the LLM help an attacker at each level of capability. And so we go through a Delphi method. We use the IDEA protocol, which is a modified Delphi where you don't need to reach a consensus. You then mathematically combine the estimates of the experts. And then here we're also, and I'll tell you more about this, but we're also experimenting with LLMs themselves as estimators, given that one bottleneck here is, of course, the how many experts you have access to and their time, right? Since there's only a limited set of people in the world that are experts at AI times bio or AI times cyber. So that's the AI uplift. on a parameter by parameter basis. And then we aggregate them. So we combine them in what's called the Bayesian belief network, which I'll show you. We fit the relevant distributions to the parameters, do Monte Carlo sampling, and create these full probability distributions. And important to note here that this is not sort of the end goal, right? Like we get these distributions, but they should be taken with a huge grain of salt because there's so much uncertainty in these models. But they are a means to an end. So we create these distributions in order to then be able to conduct sensitivity analysis and ask questions of our risk models and see the directionally and comparatively how the risk changes for when we tweak various factors, which I'll show you. So that is the methodology that we have developed. And again, this is a methodology. Like we heard from Manuel, there are different methodologies that are being put out there for risk modeling. So it's a very nascent field. And as I mentioned, I'll end this presentation with some of the open questions. I recently convened a workshop with 5 different AI safety organizations, all working on risk modeling, and where we compared our approaches. And there's still many, many things to resolve before we all converge on sort of one truth. But let me now show you some of the cool questions that you can ask from your risk models once you have built them. And these are in the cyber specifically. So why did we pick cyber? This is the chart that you probably have been seeing all day long. Basically, cyber is this potentially the canary in the coal mine, right? Like it's already last year, it was the one where we believe there was the highest near-term risk, where we would see AI impact the fastest. And I think now with Mythos and GPT 5.5, we are seeing that is the case, right? Like this is the one where the shit, sort of, so to say, has hit the fan most dramatically. So cyber is a good example to where we have measurable impact already in the real world. So what we do, I showed you, like we define these 9 risk models, and then for each of them we flesh out a scenario. So starting with the levels of the dimensions that I mentioned. So this, for example, is OC3 financial and DDoS. So an OC3 level actor, which could be a criminal syndicate, a financial target. So here we picked a mid-sized European financial institution, and a DDoS attack, so a ransom DDoS attack against this institution. And then we write out the scenario in a lot of detail so that we make it as realistic as possible, looking at what the defenses are in place at that kind of target, and looking at the exact steps that they would follow. And this is where we apply MITRE ATT&CK. Like, so similar to what we heard from Manuel, it is a very useful taxonomy for breaking down the attack. So MITRE ATT&CK has 14 categories of tactics, and for each of these risk models, we then go through and see which ones apply. So in this type of attack, for example, you need to have reconnaissance, you need to have resource development, but you don't need, for example, privilege escalation, since it's a DDoS attack. But these will vary for each of the different risk models. And then we map these in these Bayesian networks. So this looks very complicated, and it probably looks very small on your screen as well. But basically, it just has a few key levels where we insert different kinds of data. So at the top level, you have those high-level parameters. So the overall success rate of an attack, the overall damage that would result from a successful attack, the overall risk that then would result from the combination of these. And then the next 2 levels are those steps in the attack. So this is where the MITRE tactics come in on the first level, and the MITRE techniques at the next level. So as I mentioned, we take the steps that are applicable, and then for each of them, we break out into techniques where relevant. And then at the bottom, you have the empirical data. So in this case, the benchmarks that then get mapped to these nodes and inform each node, so that you can then set different probability of success at different steps, for example, depending on how capable the model is, how far down the benchmark that its performance reaches. And so that's the kind of the visual for the Bayesian network. For each of these nodes, then, there are a number of different estimates. So first of all, we want to capture the uncertainty, right? So you have a central value, which is the mode in this case, as well as the 5th and 95th percentile. So you have that confidence interval around there, which is essential to capture the large uncertainty in these estimates. And then, as I mentioned, we do these estimates for baseline, which is the non-AI assisted world, and then for two AI worlds, so to say, the SOTA and saturated. So SOTA is state of the art, which is where current best performance of models. So where do they get to on these benchmarks currently? And then saturated, which is when they can fulfill every task on the benchmarks in question, and we have reached sort of full capability in these parameters. So a total of 9 different estimates, which, as I mentioned, which is why this becomes labor and resource intensive, and then we do this for each parameter. And then the results at a high level can start to tell us things already, right? Even as I mentioned, like even we should take the numbers with a huge grain of salt. We can't trust the numbers directly, but we can start looking at, does most of the risk come, now or at saturated levels, for example, right? So here, for example, at the baseline, we have 13 billion in total risk for this specific scenario. And it only increases a little bit at 19% at SOTA, but then it's forecasted to increase significantly at saturated levels. So that would suggest there's sort of more risk heading ahead of us as models progress. And then, very importantly, for setting thresholds, we can look at the tail risk. So what is the worst outcomes in the 95th percentile, and how much do those increase? And what is the potential worst outcome that we need to definitely defend against? So here, for example, you see a huge increase up to 77 billion in the tail for at saturated. So those are kind of some of the high-level questions you can look at. And then you can start digging into the model and asking all kinds of other interesting questions. So one, for example, that we often ask, and Emmanuel talked about, the floor and ceiling risks, right? Which is basically, does AI increase the ceiling? Is it for the already capable actors? Does it make them just much more lethal and effective? Or is it a floor effect where it actually levels the playing field and the low-level actors now can act as higher-level actors? So here, what you have here is the 9 risk scenarios on the x-axis for OC1 through OC5. So OC1 is the most basic hobby hacktivists. OC5 is the most advanced nation states, and these different types of attacks that I mentioned. And then you have the total risk that we're comparing here. So baseline is the dashed line horizontally, and then SOTA level is blue and saturated level is green. So here you can then start to look at things like, has the risk, is it already much increased at current SOTA levels compared to the baseline, or is most of the risk ahead of us? Like you see here for OC3 SME ransomware, for example, it's really at saturated where there's the risk increases a lot. And here you can see, at lower levels here, these estimates would suggest that those more basic actors get a huge sort of lifting of the floor effect, right? Like they're able to create a lot more risk. And then for the most advanced actors, there may be, at least according to these estimates, right, there may not be that much of an effect because they're already so capable. So that's one type of analysis, just looking at the different actors and how much they get help or not. Then you can look at the distributions and look at those tail risks that I mentioned, the worst case outcomes. So here, as you go from the solid line, which is the baseline, the non-AI risk, and as you move to the dashed SOTA and saturated risks, you can see how in which of these scenarios do we get large uptick in the tails. So, for example, you see in that first one, the OC1 phishing, how while the damage was kind of fairly capped at fairly low levels in the non-AI world, with the AI lifts that cap and enables you have a lot longer tail with a lot more risk that could take place. So that's kind of looking at the distributions. Another thing you may want to ask is, how does AI affect the nature of the risk? Is it more that more people can execute these kinds of scenarios? Is it that they get much better at it, or is it that the overall damage when they do succeed, it gets much higher? So here, what we do here is looking at Shapley values to explain the drivers of the variation of the total risk based on these four top level parameters. So basically, probability of successful attack in green, the number of actors that are able and willing to conduct a kind of attack in blue, the number of attempts they can do, which is the scale factor in yellow, and the damage in orange here, or peach. And you can see how it's actually very different for different scenarios, right? In some cases, it is just that, yep, the probability goes up a lot. Like the attacker gets more efficient and more effective at executing, and is more likely to succeed with the steps of the attack. But in other cases, like that has much less effect, and it's just the damage goes up for each successful attack because it becomes that much more impactful. And you can even have negative effects, right? Where AI would actually, you would have so many more low-level actors that would attempt it that the damage per attack goes down, for example, but you just have much more attacks because the scale increases. So that's another lens you can look at it. And then I wanted to show you, we break it down into sort of three types of uplift: efficacy, volume, and target. And these are all interesting for different reasons. So I wanted to show you these. Efficacy is the quality, as we talked about. So the probability of success, right? So again, you have baseline and you have saturated and SOTA levels, and you can see just how much more likely is an attack to succeed. So that's efficacy. And you can contrast that with volume. So volume is the scale, right? So here is where the automation kicks in. So maybe AI doesn't make each attack better, but maybe it just allows them to start many more attacks. So for example, if the more you can automate the reconnaissance and the phishing stages, for example, you can just let loose many more attacks. So here you can see how the number of attacks or attack attempts increases, and especially at the lower levels of actors, right? There's a huge effect there. And then finally, we also try to analyze with something we call target uplift, which is, does AI enable attackers to go after more advanced targets? So for example, something that would have been sort of out of their league without AI, does that fall into the realm of possibilities? So what we did is we created some of these risk models that contrasted an attack on a large target versus a small target, but otherwise kept everything the same. So this is OC4, which is so nation states, but not the most advanced nation states operations, going after infrastructure. So it could be a power plant, for example, but contrasting very large ones in blue versus smaller ones in green. And this is a trickier one to sort of try to tease out the results. But what we did here was just plot how many of these actors would conduct the different types of attacks on these different types of targets at different levels of capability. And these estimates would suggest that at higher levels of AI capabilities, when it is saturated for these benchmarks, you would be able to see it. You would have more actors that would proportionally go after the bigger targets. So that increases the amount of people that they need to worry about. So that's target uplift. And then, very importantly, as we talked about before as well, is the view from the defender side, right? So where should you focus mitigations? So as we talked about, as a defender, you have limited resources. You can't just strengthen your defenses across the board. So here, what we look at is how the Shapley values vary per probability for each of the MITRE steps, right? So again, along the x-axis, you have the 9 risk models, and along the y-axis, you have the 14 MITRE attack tactics. And then you can see which ones drive the biggest increases in risk. So this then, instead of having a blanket approach where you sort of peanut butter your resources, this can allow you to then pinpoint exactly, okay, AI will help, for example, in defense evasion, in this kind of attack, this is where we should focus our efforts on prevention. So those are some of the many interesting types of questions that you can ask of your risk models. And of course, these charts make it look like this is all a sort of settled science and so on, but which is far from the case, right? It is a very nascent field, and it is one that is rapidly developing. So this is one approach. This is the methodology that we have developed, but we hope to see many other variations of this methodology, given that it is highly modular and you don't need to do each step exactly as we planned it. So let's look at some of the open questions. First, I want to look at this LLM estimator idea, because basically, as I mentioned, it's a huge bottleneck to try to find human experts to do all of these estimates. As I showed you, it is 9 estimates for each parameter. So we've been experimenting with LLM estimators to give them specific profiles and have them go through a Delphi process and come out with the estimates. And it's highly interesting here, and I think Mario had done some similar research here as well. How LLM estimators are different than humans. So in this chart, this is overall risk plotted in a 3-dimensional chart against both the benchmarks that we used in our study last year, which was Bounty Bench and SciBench. And basically, as models get more capable, i.e., as they move down the X and Z axes and can solve higher level tasks, how much does the risk increase? And this is the human one on the left here, as you can see, which fairly smooth increase. When at saturation of both of these benchmarks, we have a lot higher risk and a fairly smooth curve from the baseline. LLMs, on the other hand, provide this chart on the right, which is much more spiky and much more varied and much more sort of dissonant. And of course, we don't know which one is the correct one, because we don't yet have ground truth to compare these two. But basically, what this suggests is that LLMs may have either they have less of the bias that human have, where we want to impose a sort of a smooth curve on reality, and whether that fits the facts on the ground or not. So either LLMs are better at looking at each cyber capability in isolation and not fall prey to that bias, or it's the opposite, that LLMs have poor context window, and they should be keeping the whole pattern in mind, but they don't, and therefore they give these more spiky results. So that is something that I think requires a lot more research, which is could be really interesting, because I think we will need these kinds of LLM estimators to do this at scale, and we've seen very promising results from LLM forecasters. The other interesting thing with the LLM estimators is that they're also more conservative. So they're actually less likely to have large uncertainty intervals. They're less likely to ascribe the very worst case outcomes. And this, again, we don't know who is correct, right? Like there is a known bias in human expert elicitation where a human can foresee a worst case outcome, and therefore since they can foresee it, they give it some small level of probability, and LLMs may just not have that bias. Or it is the opposite, that LLMs just stick too close to the baseline and are unable to extrapolate properly. So highly interesting how these two should be used together. And they're clearly not substitutes, right? Like, they have different biases, different profiles, so they should be used as complements. And then my final couple of slides here just look at some other open questions. And these are open research questions where I would love to see more research if anybody's interested. First, we have in terms of architecture, so how you build the model. So we have quite elaborate models, as you saw with like Monte Carlo, etc., versus other AI safety approaches that just do a pure sort of factor multiplication. So that is an open question, right? Like how detailed and how statistically sort of heavy should these models be? And that a big part of that is the interdependencies, right? Like how do you deal with interdependencies between factors? So we try to make each estimate conditional on specific factors, but it is still hard to avoid some of that. Model scope, similarly, like how granular should you get? Should you use uncertainty ranges? So we use 90% confidence intervals, or should you just use point estimates because the uncertainty ranges give you sort of false precision? There's also a big question of marginal versus nominal risk. So in the AI companies frameworks, we're seeing more and more use of marginal risk, which is basically looking at how much risk does this model add on top of what's already out there. Is that what we want as the baseline, or is it the nominal, like compared to a non-AI world, right? Like those are both very different, but both important types of estimates. And then the nodes themselves, we had one interesting methodology from Google DeepMind where they looked, instead of looking at probabilities for each step like we did, they looked at cost reduction. So it has a pure cost exercise and just how much cheaper does it become for an attacker to do each step of the kill chain. So that is one option. I think probabilities are a bit more universal, but it is an open question. And then, of course, offense versus defense. So what we're seeing now with Mythos, but also, like Manuel said, the use of you don't need to have Mythos to do this on the defense side. Should this be modeled into the same risk models that where you have AI impacts on offense and defense? And there is a MITRE taxonomy for defense as well. Or should these be kept as separate models because they are separate questions after all? So that's a very interesting open question. And then the translation, right? So this is going back to how we take empirical data and translate it into risk. So with benchmarks, we are seeing a lot of issues, right? There's been concerns around the validity of benchmarks and how valid they are in the real world, which we're trying to solve with this risk modeling. But there's also been a sort of wider dissolution lately of benchmarks given how quickly they saturate. So should we try to use other empirical data? Maybe the incident report could be a better one, or maybe not try to map, benchmarks to each node, but just on a scenario basis. And how do we combine different sources? And then also there's a question of who maps, right? Like I talked already about LLM experts versus human experts, but there's also human forecasters. So in some of our studies, we've employed super forecasters, and that might be a way to overcome the bottleneck for human risk domain experts. So lots of open questions that need more research, and I believe it's very valuable to do. And basically, we are at an early stage with risk modeling, right? And my hope is that we will go the way of aviation, where sort of risk models embraced uncertainty early on. There was a lot of incident sharing and information sharing between industry and regulators, and we sort of quickly established a methodology for risk modeling, as opposed to the worst case outcome is kind of if you remember the financial crisis in the 2000s, where there were models, but they were proprietary. They were completely devoid from reality. The assumptions were not tested or validated. The models just baked in uncertainty where people didn't know it was there, and we ended up with the financial crash of 2009. So my hope is that we will go more in the aviation direction, but it is that remains to be seen. So thank you. That's what I wanted to share in terms of risk modeling and our approach. So happy to take any questions that you might have on that.